Hello, hello world. Good evening. I am very pleased to be back. I apologize for last night's great hiatus. I was horizontal all day due to a delicious dose of vaccination, which rendered me completely useless. So I'm sorry I missed out on reading to you. Um, I will. I'm feeling much better, and I will be reading to you this evening. So that's great. um, this evening's first tale is called. Oh, I didn't dedicate it to anybody. Hmm. This evening, I would like to dedicate the reading to. Um, I would like to dedicate it to a friend named Sarah Lord, whom I met in India many, many years ago, um, who was a development student back in the day and then became a doctor, who is probably somewhere in Australia and who is a very brilliant woman who wanted to make change in the world, that I'm sure she is doing now. I have no idea why it's for Sarah, but it's for Sarah. I hope you're doing well. This first tale is called Cherry or the Frog Bride. There was once a king who had 3 sons. Not far from his kingdom lived an old woman who had an only daughter called Cherry. The king sent his sons out to see the world, that they might learn the ways of foreign lands, and get wisdom and skill in ruling the kingdom that they were one day to have for their own. But the old woman lived at peace at home with her daughter, who was called Cherry, because she liked cherries better than any other kind of food, and would eat scarcely anything else. Now her poor old mother had no garden, and no money to buy cherries every day for her daughter, and at last there was no other plan left but to go to a neighbouring nunnery garden and beg the finest she could get of the nuns, for she dared not let her daughter go out by herself, as she was very pretty, and she feared some mischance might befall her. Cherry's taste was, however, very well known, and as it happened that the abbess was as fond of cherries as she was, it was soon found out that all of her best fruit went, and the Holy Mother was not a little angry at missing some of her stock and finding whither it had gone. The princes, while wandering on, came one day to the town where Cherry and her mother lived, and as they passed along the street saw the fair maiden standing at the window, combing her long and beautiful locks of hair. Then each of the three fell deeply in love with her, and began to say how much he longed for her for his wife. Scarcely had the wish been spoken when all drew their swords, and a dreadful battle began. The fight lasted long, and the rage grew hotter and hotter, when at last the abbess, hearing the uproar, came to the gate. Finding that her neighbour was the cause, her old spite against her broke forth at once, and in her rage she whisked Cherry into an ugly frog, and sitting in the water under the bridge at the world's end. No sooner said than done, and poor Cherry became a frog, and vanished out of their sight. The princes had now nothing to fight for, so sheathing their swords again, they shook hands as brothers and went on towards their father's home. The old king meanwhile found that he grew weak and ill fitted for the business of reigning, so he thought of giving up his kingdom. But to whom should it be? This was a point that his fatherly heart could not settle, for he loved all his sons alike. "My dear children," said he, "I grow old and weak, and should like to give up my kingdom, but I cannot make up my mind which of you to choose for my heir. For I love all three, and besides, I should wish to give my people the cleverest and best of you for their king. However, I will give you three trials, and the one who wins the prize shall have the kingdom. The first is to seek me out 100 ells of cloth, so fine that I can draw it through my golden ring." The sons said they would do their best and set out on the search. The two eldest brothers took with them many followers and coaches and horses of all sorts, to bring home all the beautiful cloths to which they should find. But the youngest went alone by himself. They soon came to where the roads branched off into several ways. Two ran through smiling meadows with smooth paths and shady groves, but the third looked dreary and dirty, and went all over barren wastes. The two eldest chose the pleasant ways, and the youngest took his leave and whistled along over the dreary road. Whenever fine linen was to be seen, the two elder brothers bought it, and bought so much that their coaches and horses bent under their burden. The youngest, on the other hand, journeyed on many a weary day, and found not a place where he could buy even one piece of cloth that was at all fine and good. His heart sunk beneath him, and every mile he grew more and more heavy and sorrowful. At last he came to a bridge over a stream, and there he sat himself down to rest and sigh over his bad luck, when an ugly-looking frog popped its head out of the water and asked, with a voice that was not at all a harsh sound to his ears, what was the matter. The prince said in a pet, "Silly frog, thou canst not help me." "Who told you so?" said the frog. "Tell me what ails you." After a while the prince opened the whole story and told why his father had sent him out. "I will help you," said the frog. So it jumped back into the stream and soon came back dragging a small piece of linen not bigger than one's hand, and by no means the cleanest in the world in its look. However, there it was, and the prince was told to take it away with him. He had no great liking for such a dirty rag, but still there was something in the frog's speech that pleased him much, and he thought to himself, "It can do no harm. It is better than nothing." So he picked it up and put it in his pocket and thanked the frog, who dived down again, panting and quite tired, as it seemed, with its work. The farther he went, the heavier he found his great joy to the pocket grow, and he soon turned himself homewards, trusting greatly in his good luck. He reached home nearly about the same time that his brothers came up, with their horses and coaches all heavily laden. Then the old king was very glad to see his children again, and pulled the ring off his finger to try who had done the best. But in all the stock which the two elders had bought, there was not one piece a tenth part of which would go through the ring. At this they were greatly abashed, for they had made a laugh of their brother, who came home, as they thought, empty-handed. But how great was their anger when they saw him pull from his pocket a piece that for the softest oh, from his pocket a piece that for softness, beauty, and whiteness was 1,000 times better than anything that was ever before seen. Hmm. It was so fine that it passed with ease through the ring. Indeed, two such pieces would readily have gone in together. The father embraced the lucky youth, told his servants to throw the coarse linen into the sea, and said to his children, "Now, you must set about the second task which I am to set you. Bring me home a little dog so small that it will lie in a nutshell." His sons were not a little frightened at such a task, but they all longed for the crown and made up their minds to go and try their hands. And so, after a few days, they set out once more on their travels. At the crossways they parted as before, and the youngest chose his old dreary rugged road, with all the bright hopes that his former good luck gave him. Scarcely had he sat himself down again at the bridge foot, when his old friend the frog jumped out, setting itself beside him, and as before, opened its big wide mouth and croaked out, "What is the matter?" The prince had this time no doubt of the frog's power, and therefore told what he wanted. "It shall be done for you," said the frog, and sprang into the stream. It soon brought up a hazelnut, laid it at his feet, and told him to take it home to his father and crack it gently, and then see what would happen. The prince went his way, very pleased, and the frog, tired with its task, jumped back into the water. His brothers had reached home first, and brought with them a great very many pretty little dogs. The old king, willing to help them all he could, went for a large walnut, and tried it with every one of the little dogs. But one stuck fast with its hind foot out, and the other with its head, and a third with its forefoot, and a fourth with its tail. In short, some one way or some another, but none was at all likely to sit easily in this kind of canoe. When all had been tried, the youngest made his father a dutiful vow, and gave him the hazelnut, begging him to crack it very carefully. The moment this was done, out ran a beautiful little white dog upon the king's hand, wagging its tail, fondled his new master, and soon turned about and barked at the other little beasts in the most graceful manner, to the delight of the whole court. The joy of everyone was great, and the old king again embraced his lucky son, told his people to draw out all the other dogs in the sea, and said to his children, "Dear sons, your weightiest tasks are now over. Listen to my last wish. Whoever brings home the fairest lady shall be at once the heir to my crown." The prize was so tempting, and the chance so fair for all, that none made any doubts about setting to work, each in his own way, to try and be the winner. The youngest was not in such good spirits as he was the last time. He thought to himself, "The old frog has been able to do a great deal for me, but all its powers must be nothing to me now, for where should it find me a fair maiden, still less a fairer maiden than was ever seen at my father's court? The swamps where it lives have no living things in them but toads, snakes, and such vermin." Meanwhile he went on, and sighed, as he sat down again with a heavy heart by the bridge. "Ah, frog," said he, "this time thou canst do me no good." "Never mind," croaked the frog. "Only tell me what is the matter now." Then the prince told his old friend what trouble had now come upon him. "Go thy ways home," said the frog. "The fair maiden will follow hard after, but take care and do not laugh at whatever may happen." This said, it sprang as before into the water and was soon out of sight. The prince still sighed on, for he trusted very little this time the frog's word. But he had not set any steps towards home before he heard a noise behind him, and looked round, saw 6 large water rats dragging along a large pumpkin like a coach, full trot. On the box sat an old fat toad as coachman, and behind stood 2 little frogs as footmen, and 2 fine mice where stately whiskers ran before as outriders. Within sat his old friend the frog, rather misshapen and unseemly to be sure, but still with somewhat of a graceful air as it bowed to him in passing. Much too deeply wrapped in thought as to his chance to finding the fair lady whom he was seeking, to take any heed of the strange scene before him, the prince scarcely looked at it, and was still less mind to laugh. The couch passed on a little way, and soon turned a corner that hid it from its sight. But how astonished was he, on turning the corner himself, to find a handsome coach with 6 black horses standing there, with a coachman in gay livery, and within the most beautiful lady he had ever seen, whom he soon knew to be the fair Cherry, for whom his heart so long panted. As he came up, the servants opened the coach door, and he was allowed to seat himself by the beautiful lady. They soon came to his father's city, where his brothers also came, with trains of fair ladies. But as soon as Cherry was seen, all the court gave her with one voice the crown of beauty. The delighted father embraced his son, and named him the heir to his crown, and ordered all the other ladies to be thrown, like the little dogs, into the sea and drowned. Then the prince married Cherry, and lived long and happily with her, and indeed lives with her still, if he be not dead. The end. Little genocide to begin the evening. It's pleasant. Our second tale for this evening is called, how shall we choose to pronounce this? It's called Mother Holle. Let's say Holle. A widow had 2 daughters. One of them was very pretty and thrifty, but the other was ugly and idle. Odd, as you may think it, she loved the ugly and idle one much the best, and the other was made to do all the work, and was in short, quite the drudge of the whole house. Every day she had to sit on a bench by a well on the side of the high road before the house, and spin so much that her fingers were quite sore, and at length the blood would come. Now it happened that once when her fingers had bled, the spindle was all bloody. She dipped it into the well, and meant to wash it, but unluckily it fell from her hand and dropped in. Then she ran crying to her mother and told her what had happened. But she scolded her sharply and said, "If you have been so silly as to let the spindle fall in, you must get in again as well you can." So the poor little girl went back to the well, and knew not how to begin, but in her sorrow threw herself into the water, and sank down to the bottom senseless. In a short time she seemed to awaken as from a trance, and came to herself again. And when she opened her eyes and looked around, she saw that she was in a beautiful meadow, where the sun shone brightly, the birds sang sweetly on their boughs, and thousands of flowers sprang beneath her feet. Then she rose up and walked along this delightful meadow, and came to a pretty cottage by the side of a wood. And when she went in, she saw an oven full of new bed breaking. New bed breaking. Oh, why is that hard? She saw an oven full of new baking. And the bread said, pull me out, or I shall be burnt, for I am quite done enough." So she stepped up quickly, and took it all out. Then she went on farther, and came to a tree, that was full of finely rose-cheeked apples, and it said to her, shake me, we are all quite ripe." So she shook the tree, and the apples fell down like a shower until there was no more upon the tree. Then she went on again, and at length came to a small cottage where an old woman was sitting at the door. The little girl would have run away, but the old woman called out after her, "Don't be frightened, my dear child. Stay with me. I shall like to have you for my little maid, and if you do all the work in the house neatly, you shall fare well. But take care to make my bed nicely, and shake it every morning out at the door, so that the feathers may fly. For then the good people below say it snows. I am Mother Holle." As the old woman spoke so kindly to her, the girl was willing to do as she said. So she went into her employ, and took care to do everything to please her, and always shook the bed well, so that she led a very quiet life with her, and every day she had good meat, both boiled and roast, to eat for her dinner. But when she had been some time with the old lady, she became sorrowful, and although she was much better off than when she was at home, still she had a longing towards it, and at length said to her mistress, "I used to grieve my troubles at home, but if they were all to come again, and I were sure of faring ever so well here, I could not stay any longer." "You are right," said her mistress. "You shall do as you like, and as you have worked for me so faithfully, I will myself show you the way back again." Then she took her by the hand and led her behind the cottage, and opened a door. And as the girl stood underneath, there fell a heavy shower of gold, so that she held out her apron and caught a great deal of it. And the fairy put on a shining golden dress over her and said, "All this you shall have, because you have been so well behaved." And she gave her back the spindle which had fallen into the well, and led her out by another door. When it shut behind her, she found herself not far from her mother's house, and as she went into the courtyard, the cock sat upon the well-head and clapped his wings and cried out, "Cock-a-doo! Our golden lady's come home again." Then she went into the house, and as she was so rich, she was welcomed home. When her mother heard how she got these riches, she wanted to have the same luck for her ugly and idle daughter. So she too was told to sit by the well and spin. That her spindle might be bloody, she pricked her fingers with it, and when that would not do, she thrust her hand into a thorn bush. Then she threw it into the well and sprung in herself afterwards. Like her sister, she came to a beautiful meadow and followed the same path. When she came to the oven in the cottage, the bread called out as before, "Take me out, or I shall burn. I am quite done enough." But the lazy girl said, "A pretty story indeed, just as if I should dirty myself for you," and went on her way. She soon came to the apple tree that cried, shake me, for my apples are quite ripe." But she answered, "I will take care how I do that, for one of you might fall upon my head." So she went on. At length she came to Mother Holle's house, and readily agreed to be her maid. The first day she behaved herself very well, and did what her mistress told her, for she thought of the gold she would give her. But the second day she began to be lazy, and the third still more so, for she would not get up in the morning early enough. And when she did, she made the bed very badly, and did not shake it so that the feathers would fly out. Mother Holle was soon tired of her, and turned her off. But the lazy girl was quite pleased at that, and thought to herself, "Now the golden rain will come." Then the fairy took her to the same door, but when she stood under it, instead of gold, A great kettle full of dirty pitch came showering upon her. "That is your wages," said Mother Holle, as she shut the door upon her. So she went home quite black with the pitch, and as she came near her mother's house, the cock sat upon the well and clapped his wings and cried out, "Cock-a-doodle-doo, our dirty slut's come home again." The end. That was a funny ending. Mm, The third tale of this evening is called The Water of Life. The Water of Life. Long before you and I were born, there reigned in a country a great way off a king who had 3 sons. This king once fell very ill, so ill that nobody thought he would live. His sons were very much grieved at their father's sickness, and as they walked weeping in the garden of the palace, an old man met them and asked what they ailed. They told him their father was so ill that they were afraid nothing could save him. "I know what would," said the old man. "It is the water of life. If he could have a draught of it, he would be well again, but it is very hard to get." Then the eldest son said, "I will soon find it," and went to the sick king and begged that he might go in search of the water of life, as it was the only thing that could save him. "No," said the king, "I would rather die than place you in such great danger as you must meet with on your journey." But he begged so hard that the king let him go, and the prince thought to himself, "If I bring my father this water, I shall be his dearest son, and he will make me heir to his kingdom." Then he set out, and when he had gone on his way some time, he came to a deep valley overhung with rocks and woods. And as he looked around, there stood above him on one of the rocks a little dwarf, who called out to him and said, "Prince, whither hast thou so fast?" "Whither hastest thou so fast?" Sorry. "Prince, whither hastest thou so fast?" "What is that to you, little ugly one?" said the prince sneeringly, and rode on his way. But the little dwarf fell into a great rage at his behaviour, and laid a spell of ill luck upon him, so that, as he rode on, the mountain pass seemed to become narrower and narrower, and at last the way was so straitened that he could not step forward. And when he thought to have his horse round, when he thought to have turned his horse round and gone back the way he came, the passage he found was closed behind also, and shut him quite up. This is a very long sentence. He next tried to get off his horse and make his way on foot, but this he was unable to do, and so there he was forced to abide, spellbound. Meantime, the king, his father, was lingering on a daily hope of his return, till at last the second son came. "Father, I will go in search of this water," for he thought to himself, "My brother is surely dead, and the kingdom will fall to me if I have good luck on my journey." The king was at first very unwilling to let him go, but at last yielded to his wish. So he set out and followed the same road which his brother had taken, and met the same dwarf, who stopped him at the same spot, and said as before, "Prince, whither hastest thou so fast?" "Mind your own affairs, busybody," answered the prince scornfully, and rode off. But the dwarf put the same enchantment upon him, and when he came, like the other, to the narrow pass on the mountains, he could neither move forward nor backward. Thus it is with proud, silly people who think themselves too wise to take advice. When the second prince had thus stayed away a long while, the youngest said he would go and search for the water of life, and trusted he should soon be able to make his father well again. The dwarf met him too at the same spot, and said, "Prince, whither hastest thou so fast?" And the prince said, "I go in search of the water of life, because my father is ill and like to die. Can you help me?" "Do you know where it is to be found?" asked the dwarf. "No," said the prince. "Then, as you have spoken to me kindly and sought for advice, I will tell you how and where to go. The water you seek springs from a well in an enchanted castle, and that you may be able to go in safely, I will give you an iron wand and 2 little loaves of bread. Strike the iron door of the castle 3 times with the wand, and it will open. 2 hungry lions will be lying down inside, gaping for their prey, but if you throw them the bread, they will let you pass. Then hasten on to the well and take some of the water of life before the clock strikes 12, for if you tarry longer, the door will shut upon you forever." Then the prince thanked the dwarf for his friendly aid, and took the wand and the bread, and went travelling on and on over sea and land till he came to his journey's end, and found everything to be as the dwarf had told him. The door flew open at the third stroke of the wand, and when the lions were quieted, he went through the castle, and came at length to a beautiful hall. Around it he saw 7 knights sitting in a trance. Then he pulled off their rings and put them on his own fingers. In another room he saw on a table a sword and a loaf of bread, which he also took. Farther on he came to a room where a beautiful young lady sat upon a couch. She welcomed him joyfully and said, if he would set her free from the spell that bound her, the kingdom should be his if he would come back in a year and marry her. Then she told him that the well that held the water of life was in the palace gardens, and bade him make haste and draw what he wanted before the clock struck 12. Then he went on, and as he walked through the beautiful gardens, he came to a delightful shady spot in which stood a couch. And he thought to himself, as he felt tired, that he would rest for a while and gaze on the lovely scenes around him. So he laid himself down, and sleep fell upon him unawares, and he did not wake up till the clock was striking 11:45. Then he sprung from the couch dreadfully frightened, ran to the well, filled a cup that was standing by him full of water, and hastened to get away in time. Just as he was going out of the iron door, it struck 12, and the door fell so quickly upon him that it tore away a piece of his heel. Then when he found himself safe, he was overjoyed to think that he got the water of life, and as he was going on his way homewards, he passed by the little dwarf, who, when he saw the sword and the loaf, said, "You have made a noble prize. With the sword you can at a blow slay whole armies, and the bread will never fail." Then the prince thought to himself, "I cannot go home to my father without my brothers." So he said, "Dear dwarf, cannot you tell me where my 2 brothers are, who set out in search of the water of life before me and never came back?" "I have shut them up by a charm between 2 mountains," said the dwarf, "because they were proud and ill-behaved, and scorned to ask advice." The prince begged so hard for his brothers that the dwarf at last set them free, though unwillingly, saying, "Beware of them, for they have bad hearts." Their brother, however, was greatly rejoiced to see them, and told them all that had happened to him. how he had found the water of life and had taken a full cup of it, and how he had set a beautiful princess free from a spell that bound her, and how she had engaged to wait a whole year, and then to marry him and give him the kingdom. Then they all three rode on together, and on their way came to a country that was laid waste by war and dreadful famine, so that it was feared all must die for want. But the prince gave the king of the land the bread, and all his kingdom ate of it. And he slew the enemy's army with the wonderful sword, and left the king in peace and plenty. In the same manner he befriended two other countries that they passed through on their way. When they came to the sea, they got into a ship, and during the voyage the two eldest said to themselves, "Our brother has got the water, which we could not find. Therefore our father will forsake us, and give him the kingdom, which is our right." So they were full of envy and revenge, and agreed together how they could ruin him. They waited till he was fast asleep, then poured the water of life in out of the cup and took it for themselves, giving him bitter sea water instead. And when they came to their journey's end, the younger son brought up his cup to the sick king, that he might drink and be healed. Scarcely, however, had he tasted the bitter sea water, that he became worse even than he was before. And then both the elder sons came in and blamed the youngest for what he had done, and said that he wanted to poison their father, but that they had found the water of life and had brought it with them. He no sooner began to drink of what they brought him, that he felt his sickness leave him, and was as strong and well as in his young days. And then they went to their brother and laughed at him and said, "Well, brother, you found the water of life, did you? You have had the trouble, and why shall and we shall have the reward." Let me try again. "Well, brother, you found the water of life, did you? You have had the trouble, and we shall have the reward. Pray, with all your cleverness, why did you not manage to keep your eyes open? Next year, one of us will take away your beautiful princess. If you do not take care, you had better say nothing about this to our father, for he does not believe a word you say, and if you tell tales, you shall lose your life into the bargain. But be quiet, and we will let you go off." The old king was still very angry with his younger son, and thought he really meant to have taken away his life. So he called his court together and asked what should be done, and it was settled that he should be put to death. The prince knew nothing of what was going on till one day when the king's huntsman went a hunting with him, and they were alone in the wood together. The huntsman looked so sorrowful that the prince said, "My friend, what is the matter with you?" "I cannot and dare not tell you," said he. But the prince begged hard and said, "Only say what it is, and do not think I shall be angry, for I will forgive you." "Alas," said the huntsman, "the king has ordered me to shoot you." The prince started at this and said, "Let me live, and I will change dress with you. You shall take my royal coat to show to my father, and do you give me your shabby one?" "With all my heart," said the huntsman. "I am sure I shall be glad to save you, for I could not have shot you." Then he took the prince's coat and gave him the shabby one, and went away through the wood. Some time after, 3 grand embassies came to the old king's court, with rich gifts of gold and precious stones for his youngest son, which were sent from the 3 kings to whom he had lent his sword and loaf of bread, to rid them of their enemy and feed their people. This touched the old king's heart, and he thought his son might still be guiltless, and said to his court, "Ah, that my son were still alive! How it grieves me that I have killed him." He still lives, says the huntsman, and I rejoice that I had pity on him and saved him. For when the time came, I could not shoot him, but let him go in peace, and brought home his royal coat. At this the king was overwhelmed with joy, and made it known throughout all his kingdom that if his son could come to his court, he would forgive him. Meanwhile, the princess was eagerly awaiting the return of her deliverer, and had a road made leading up to her palace all of shining gold, and told her courtiers that whoever came on horseback and rode straight up to the gate upon it was her true lover, and that they must let him in. But whoever rode on one side of it, they must be sure was not the right one, and must send him away at once. The time soon came when the eldest thought he would make haste to go to the princess, and say that he was the one who had set her free, and that he should have her for his wife, and the kingdom with her. As he came before the palace and saw the golden road, he stopped to look at it, and thought to himself, "It is a pity to ride upon such a beautiful road." So he turned aside and rode to the right of it. But when he came to the gate, the guard said to him he was not what he said he was, and must go about his business. The second prince set out soon afterwards on the same errand, and when he came to the golden road, and his horse had set one foot upon it, he stopped to look at it, and thought it was very beautiful, and said to himself, "What a pity it is that anything should be tread there." And he too turned aside and rode on the left of it. But when he came to the gate, the guard said he was not the true prince, and that he too must go away. Now when the full year was come, the third brother left the wood, where he had laid for fear of his father's anger, and set out in search of his betrothed wife. So he journeyed on, thinking of her all the way, and rode so quickly that he did not even see the golden road, but went with his horse straight over it, and as he came to the gate it flew open, and the princess welcomed him with joy, and said he was her deliverer, and should now be her husband and lord of the kingdom. And the marriage was soon kept with great feasting. When it was over, the princess told him she had heard his father having forgiveness. When it was over, the princess told him she had heard of his father having forgiven him, and of his wish to come home. So he went to visit him, and told him everything, how his brothers had cheated and robbed him, and yet that he had borne all these wrongs for the love of his father. Then the old king was very angry, and wanted to punish his wicked sons. But they made their escape, and got into a ship, and sailed away over the wide seas, and were never heard any more. The end. What a strange ending to such a long story. Anyhow. Mm, the final tale of this evening is called Peter the Goatherd. Hmm. In the wilds of the Hartz forest, there is a high mountain where the fairies and goblins dance by night, and where they say the great Emperor Frederick Barbarossa still holds his court among the caverns. Now and then he shows himself and punishes those whom he dislikes, or gives some rich gift to the lucky wight whom he takes into his head to befriend. He sits on a throne of marble, with his red beard sweeping on the ground, and once or twice in a long course of years rouses himself for a while from the trance in which he is buried, but soon falls again into his former forgetfulness. Strange chances strange chances have befallen many who have strayed within the range of his court. You shall hear one of them. A great many years ago, there lived in the village at the foot of the mountain one Peter, a goatherd. Every morning he drove his flocks to feed upon the green spots that are here and there found on the mountain side. And in the evening he sometimes thought it too far to drive his charge home. So he used, in such cases, to shut it up in a spot among the woods, where an old ruined wall was left standing, high enough to form a fold, in which he could count his goats and rest in peace for the night. One evening he found that the prettiest goat of his flock had vanished soon after they were driven into this fold. But was there again in the morning. Again and again he watched, and the same strange thing happened. He thought he would look still more narrowly. He thought he would look still more narrowly, and soon drove a cleft in the old wall, through which it seemed that his favourite made her way. Peter followed, scrambling as well as he could down the side of the rock, and wondered not a little, on overtaking his goat, to find it employing itself very much at its ease in a cavern, eating corn, which kept dropping from some place above. He went into the cavern and looked about him to see where all this corn, that rattled about his ears like a hail of storm, could come from. But all was dark, and he could find no clue to this strange business. At last he stood listening. He thought he heard the neighing and stamping of horses. He listened again. It was plainly so, and after a while he was sure that horses were feeding above him, and that the corn fell from their mangers. What could these horses be, which were kept thus in a mountain where none but the goat's foot ever trod? He pondered a while, but his wonder only grew greater and greater, when on a sudden a little page came forth and begged him to follow. He did so, and came at last to a courtyard surrounded by an old wall. The spot seemed the bosom of the valley. Above rose every hand high mass Above rose on every hand high masses of rock. Wide branching trees threw their arms overhead, so that nothing but a glimmering twilight made its way through. And here, on the cool, smooth shaven turf, were 12 old knights, who looked very grave and sober, but were amusing themselves with the game of ninepins. Not a word fell from their lips, but they ordered Peter by dumb signs to busy himself in setting up the pins, as they knocked them down. At first his knees trembled, as he dared not snatch a stolen sidelong glance at the long beards and old-fashioned dresses of the worthy knights. Little by little, however, he grew bolder, and at last he plucked up his heart so far as to take his turn in the draught at the can which stood beside him, and set up the smell of the richest old wine, and sent up the smell of the richest old wine. This gave him new strength for his work, and as often as he flagged at all, he turned to the same kind friend for help in his need. Sleep at last overpowered him, and when he awoke, he found himself stretched out upon the old spot where he had folded his flock. The same green turf was spread beneath, and the same tottering walls surrounded him. He rubbed his eyes, but neither dog nor goat was to be seen, and when he had looked about him again, the grass seemed to be longer under his feet, and the trees hung over his head, which he had either and the trees hung over his head, which he had either never seen before or had forgotten. Shaking his head and hardly knowing whether he was on his right mind, he wound his way among the mountain steps, through paths where his flocks were wont to wander, but still not a goat was to be seen. Below him in the plain lay the village where his home was, and at length he took the downward path and set out with a heavy heart in search of his flock. The people who met him as he drew near to the village were all unknown to him. They were not even dressed as his neighbours were, and they all seemed as if they hardly spoke the same tongue. And when he eagerly asked after his goats, they only stared at him and stroked their chins. At last he did the same too, and what was his wonder to find that his beard has grown at least a foot long. The world, though he thought he now to himself, is turned over, or at any rate bewitched. And yet he knew the mountain as he turned round to gaze upon his woody heights, and he knew the houses and the cottages also, with their little gardens, all of which were in the same place as he had always known them. He heard some children, too, call the village by its old name, as a traveller that passed by was asking his way. Again, he shook his head and went straight through the village to his own cottage. Alas, it looked sadly out of repair, and in the courtyard lay an unknown child, in a ragged dress, and by the side of a rough, toothless dog whom he thought he ought to know, but who snarled and barked in his face when he called him to him. He set in at an opening at the wall where a door had once stood, but found all so dreary and empty that he staggered out again like a drunken man, and called his wife and children loudly by their names. But no one heard, and least no one answered. A crowd of women and children soon flocked around the long, grey-bearded man, and all broke upon him at once with the questions, "Who are you? Whom do you want?" It seemed to him so odd to ask other people at his own door after his wife and children, that in order to get rid of his crowd he named the first man that came to his head. "Hans, the blacksmith," said he. Most held their tongues and stared, but at last an old woman said, "He went these days 7 years ago to a place that you will not reach today." "Frank, the tailor, then?" "Heaven rest his soul," said an old beldame upon crutches. "He had laid these 10 years in a house that he'll never leave." Peter looked at the old woman and shuddered as he saw her to be one of his old friends, only with a strangely altered face. All wish to ask further questions were gone, but at last a young woman made her way through the gaping throng with a baby in her arms, and a little girl about 3 years old clinging to her other hand. All three looked the very image of his wife. "What is thy name?" asked he, bewildered. "Mary. And your father's?" "Heaven bless him, Peter. It is now 20 years since we sought him day and night on the mountain. His flock came back, but he never was heard of any more. I was then 7 years old." The ghost herd could no longer. "I am Peter," cried he. "I am Peter, and no other." And he took the child from his daughter's arms and kissed it. All stood gaping, and not knowing what to say or think, till at length one voice was heard. "Why, it is Peter." And then several others cried, "Yes, it is Peter. Welcome, neighbor, welcome home, after 20 long years." The end. Thank you for listening. I will read you tomorrow evening. Good night.